Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 8th of February. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Aussie banks are goners without Glass-Steagall. Foreign-owned land register won't stop erosion of Australian sovereignty. A tale of two ex-Prime Ministers. Rudd pushes war with China. Fraser pushes peace. Australian independence. First, Aussie banks are goners without Glass-Steagall. So we have an alert on the state of the Australian economy and what Australians can expect coming down the pipe. Craig, this week the well-known economist Ross Garnaut issued a warning about China and the slowdown that's coming in China and the consequences of that for Australia. And he addressed an Australian Agriculture and Resource Economics conference, and he said this about the effect on Australia. He said, quote, "So we are facing substantial downward pressure on Australian export prices over the next couple of years, a falling exchange rate, and a big downward adjustment in incomes. How much that converts into a falling gross domestic product will determine how painful that adjustment will be." End quote.
So, of course, Robbie, Ross Garnaut is what we call an economic hitman. So he would know, and in some cases he's underestimating what is potentially going to happen, given that we are so exposed to these export markets.
Well, here's the thing. It relates to a specific part of the way the Australian economy works at the moment, which is that a lot of ills have been covered up by the huge inflow of money that's been coming into Australia in the context of the global financial crisis. And this is flight capital that's been sent here because Australia is regarded as a safe haven. Now, there's only one reason though Australia is regarded as a safe haven, is that's because while China has been booming, there's been a lot of investment in mining here because we've been servicing China, right? And a lot of this money that's come here, if it hasn't been parked in bonds, it's been in the context of that China generated Australian mining boom. Not much of the rest of the economy is benefiting, but that's benefiting, and so it's helped attract the money here. If China slows down, that money can exit as quick as it's come here. And when that happens, Australia is in big trouble. The Australian financial system is in big trouble because our banks are all in big trouble, and that's what this segment's about. Before I go into the details, Craig, Warren Buffett, the famous investor, once famously said, "You can only tell who's naked when the tide goes out, and who's swimming naked when the tide goes out." And that's what is going to apply to our banks. So I've called this Australian banks are goners without Glass-Steagall. Let me go through how Australia's banks are structured to make that point. We have a very vulnerable banking system because of the structure of our banks. What's that structure? Our financial system is highly concentrated in 4 banks. Those 4 banks own 80%, or they hold 80% of the assets of the residents of Australia.
Just before you go any further, Robbie, let me just explain for the viewers what Glass-Steagall means, because this will really highlight what you're about to go through. Because see, at the present you have these huge banks, they're conglomerates, they've got property aspects to them, they're insurance companies, they're bankers, they're merchant banks, they deal in derivatives. In other words, they're not just simply a bank that used to provide mortgages and loans for an ordinary, for the economy, but for businesses, for households. They've become these gigantic masses of speculative instrument engorged enterprises, which in 1933 Roosevelt had the same problem. So what he did, Franklin Roosevelt passed the Glass-Steagall law that said, no, we are going to have healthy banks. We're going to separate out the commercial banks, so they're actually banks, from all the other stockbroking houses, insurance agencies. And he gave the banks at that point, under the Glass-Steagall legislation, 12 months to literally break themselves up. And what we're saying is, given the predicates you're about to go through, our banks have to be broken up too. We want a sound commercial banking system with sound commercial banks. We don't want these huge conglomerates that are exposing us to enormous risk.
Well, we are concerned that daily banking functions, the financial services that affect the 23 million Australians in their daily lives, that those are protected. That's what we're concerned about.
That's what we're concerned
and
about.
the way the Australian banks are at the moment, that's all at risk.
And
because
you were
of the way
saying
they're
80% of residents' assets are now tied up in 4 of these huge conglomerate banks that have a huge exposure to the global financial scene.
Well, and there's 3 things that they're exposed to, because the other thing about the banks is there's 4 of them, and they're virtually carbon copies of each other. So if an aspect of the global financial crisis affects one of those banks, it'll affect all the banks.
Yeah.
And if it affects all the banks, it affects the whole system. These are called the 4 pillars. These 4 pillars are very crumbly. It's an inbuilt vulnerability in the Australian system. So the specific exposures, and we often talk about this, they all are heavily exposed to property. It's their biggest part of their business. More exposed, each of our banks are more exposed to property as one single business sector than any other banks in the world, right? And it's over 50% for all of them of their business is property. In the case of the Commonwealth Bank, it's over 60%. And of course, that property in Australia is at inflated values. And I'll give you an example of that. Right now, you can get fixed interest loans from banks and from these non-bank lenders for just over 5%. And you see the media play a role here. They've been pushing them, promoting them big time. Oh, look, you can get fixed interest rate loans for 5%. Why? Because that's a function of this money that's flooding into Australia. It's coming in here out of desperation, and so it's coming in here really cheap, and the banks are borrowing that, the non-bank lenders are borrowing that, and they can pump it out there, and they're pumping it out in the form of these fixed interest loans because they want to sucker people into going and buying overinflated properties, because that's going to keep the property market up, right? But if that money flows out as quickly as it can, and if we can find it, we'll put a graph on the screen, Craig, of the Australian dollar in the lead up to the GFC in 2008 rising, and you'll see how sharply it fell, something like 10% in the face of a week. That's how quickly it can happen. When that money flows out, all this type of cheap money flows out with it, right? And there's nothing to prop up the property market. So the property exposure of our banks is enormous.
And the property values will then crash.
Property values will crash. So that's property. Derivatives. We often use this graph. All our banks are big players in derivatives. And derivatives is not an asset they hold, it's an exposure they have. These are gambling debts that when they go bad, they go really bad. They go so bad that it catches everyone by surprise, because none of the individual traders that are booking these derivatives contracts can believe they can all unravel so quickly, right? This was the cause of the GFC. Our banks are massively exposed in the multi-trillions of dollars each to derivatives exposure. And then finally, the other big area of exposure they all share is they're all heavily reliant on overseas loans, especially short-term overseas loans, but also long-term overseas loans. 2/3 of Australia's total foreign debt is owed by these banks alone. The big 4 banks alone owe that debt. So that type of exposure, like I said, if one of them gets into trouble, they'll all get into trouble. And it's not Australian people defaulting on their loans to the banks that are going to get them into trouble. It's these other activities, but it will affect the day-to-day banking services in a big way because of what you just said. They're conglomerates, and they are one-stop shops for all kinds of financial activities, and that's not what banks are supposed to be. Investment banks are supposed to be for trading securities. Insurance companies are supposed to be for insurance. Stockbrokers are supposed to be for brokering share trading, right? And our banks do it all, and fund management to boot, right? And this is what got them into issues like Storm Financial. In the case of Storm Financial, the Commonwealth Bank, which is supposed to be a savings bank, was talking people in Townsville into borrowing against their house so they could become share market speculators, right? Because that helped another part of the Commonwealth Bank's business, and those people all lost badly, and there's a class action against the Commonwealth Bank as a result. And there's one other thing the banks do in Australia, which no one seems to question, but which is at the heart of a lot of, frankly, corruption scandals in other parts of the world. Our banks are all into proprietary trading. Now, what proprietary trading means is that where the banks manage money for clients, right? That's their job. The banks also have their own pool of money that they trade at the same time. Now, Goldman Sachs was found out in the GFC on behalf of its clients, managing money, getting them to buy into mortgage-backed securities, and at the same time, Goldman Sachs, with its own money, was selling out of mortgage-backed securities. And it was deliberately setting up its clients to make bigger profits for itself, right? This is an enormous conflict of interest. The Glass-Steagall Act in America forbade proprietary trading entirely. Even the Volcker rule in America, which is this pathetic piece of legislation, frankly, that the US Congress, Obama put in so they didn't have to go back to Glass-Steagall. Even that, the centerpiece of it is a ban on proprietary trading. Our banks do it all the time and no one questions it. This is an enormous conflict of interest. Our banks, this is the structure of our banks. So hence we're saying, without Glass-Steagall, the way they're set up, as soon as a future shock happens, they're goners, right? And they were goners last time. The government had to step in and guarantee them because the overseas loan component became their vulnerability. That structure hasn't changed. So, Craig, there's something for Australians to consider here. We have these banks in this shape. Outside of us and a few other voices, lone voice in Australia, no one's talking about Glass-Steagall. In America, there's a bill before the Congress to reenact Glass-Steagall. In Europe, right now, there's a rush to Glass-Steagall. The following countries are putting in legislation: Italy, Iceland, Belgium, Sweden, and Switzerland. They're right now putting in Glass-Steagall legislation. In Britain, they set up this Vickers Commission, which, in order to avoid Glass-Steagall, he came up with this idea of ring fencing. So they've gone ahead with that. But as of this week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer there has already been forced to beef that up, and so now they're calling it the electric ring fence, where they're not making the banks break up, but they're making them completely cut off the different parts of their activities. So they've already been forced to beef it up. It's not quite the same thing. But all these event movements in Europe, shouldn't it make Australians start to think, well, if they're doing that out of such desperation and we're not, what do they know that we don't?
Well, Robbie, I'll go back to the illustration that someone said no one could foresee the global financial crisis.
Someone,
that was a certain Prime Minister, right?
Prime Minister.
Yet we'd been screaming it from the rooftops. Now, what that shows you is that people can remain ignorant, or they can actually find out what's going on. If people get onto our website and look up Glass-Steagall, they'll make themselves less ignorant, and therefore they won't fall into the trap of being suckered into what they're being sucked into now.
Well, that's for sure. So this is a very, very live developing picture. And like I said, I wanted to put the China context in as a warning, an alert, because that is the big issue as affecting Australia. We will monitor this very closely and keep you up to speed. But we better leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about foreign land ownership in Australia. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Foreign-owned land register won't stop the erosion of Australian sovereignty. Craig, last week you made a submission to the Commonwealth Treasury's public consultation process about setting up a register that can track the sales of land in Australia to foreign interests. What is the message that you wanted to get across in that?
Well, very simply, Robbie, it was the fact that here we are asked to comment on a foreign register of foreign ownership. And I simply asked the question, why do we need foreign ownership? And that's put a press release out to that effect, and that sort of put a cat among the pigeons, because we've got a big problem in our country. And it's one that Mr. Lyndon LaRouche identified back in 1994 when I was having discussions with him. And he said, Craig, the problem with Australians is they don't know the difference between autonomy and sovereignty. Now, we accept foreign ownership as a fait accompli because as part of the free trade globalisation pacts that the likes of Trade Minister Craig Emerson pushes, they say this mantra, you've got to have foreign investment. You've got to have foreign investment because there's no other models allowed. Now, what I say is that you know, if you allow foreign investment, you're also eroding Australians' sovereignty, particularly in food production. You know, the nation of Qatar, for example, has a company down here specifically tasked by that government to come in and buy food-producing land so it can send that food back to that country. So they're not interested in actually producing food for the whole of the world, or making Australia into a food bowl for the rest of the world. They're only interested in a very self-limiting proposal for themselves. This has got to. So, do we allow this sort of thing to happen? Now, why do we need foreign investment? Oh, because we've got to develop ourselves. What I'm saying, and what I've said in that press release, no. If we had a Commonwealth Bank in the form of a National Commonwealth Credit Bank, which we've written the legislation for, that creates the credit to fund our own enterprises, we can fund and develop the entire food bowl capacity of this country internally. We don't need foreign investment. So what I'm attacking here is this axiom that somehow we have to allow foreign investment. Now, I've gone and referenced in the press release the whole Whitlam era, and that's upset some people.
Yeah.
Right, because what Whitlam tried to do is he tried to bypass the established Anglo-American hegemony in the banking system, go outside the City of London and get funds literally to what we call buy back the farm. In other words, he was trying to nationalise, in a sense, Australia's mineral capacity back then and try and reap the benefits for our own country. Now, he got smashed politically because he was trying to do that.
But what was interesting, you included a quote where he was screaming about how the foreign ownership of our resources was so much at odds with our national interests.
Yeah, what he said, Robbie, and I'll read it to you, this is from 1966. He said, the government is condoning and encouraging the sale of our richest resources to overseas interests. Some of the most amazing mineral discoveries in our history are now in foreign hands. Foreigners do Australians the honour of employing them to dig up their own wealth to be exported overseas. The whole of our production potential in aluminium is controlled by overseas interests. Almost all the new rich iron ore discoveries, particularly in Western Australia, have been taken out of our hands. The new coal deposits in Queensland are controlled by overseas interests. 3/4 of the mining and treatment of copper is controlled by overseas interests. Already 70% of the mining of zinc is outside our control. He was trying to enforce the sovereignty to say, look, these are our resources, let's develop them for Australians. And that's what I'm saying is for farming land, let's keep the farming land in our ownership, develop whatever relationships we need to with other foreign governments and so forth, but keep the ownership in our country.
You can have joint ventures, but you keep the ownership. But on the axiom you've identified, which is this question of we need foreign investment, that's also at the heart of what's just been leaked out of Canberra, where apparently the Liberal Party have a discussion paper about creating the top end of Australia into a special tax zone so they can encourage development. But what they mean by that is if we have a low tax regime up there, that'll naturally create a market which will attract foreign investment. Australian investment as well, but also foreign investment. But what you're saying and what the CEC stands for is if we really want to develop, say, the top end, we need to do it in a much more direct way through our own directed credit that we generate ourselves.
Yeah, dump this idea of being autonomous and allow people to walk all over us and become sovereign, where we express the interest for Australians as a whole, but develop our capacity for the rest of the world at the same time. It's not chauvinistic, it's not exclusive, but it is actually protecting the ability for us to really develop.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Craig. When we come back, we're going to talk about a tale of two ex-Prime Ministers. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, a tale of two ex-Prime Ministers. Rudd pushes war with China. Fraser pushes peace, Australian independence. For regular watchers of this program, I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but the question of war with China is still the number one issue facing Australia, frankly. And as of this last 7 or 8 days, that has really heated up. The most serious incident to date in this last period of tension with China happened on the 30th of January. There was an altercation between a Chinese frigate and a Japanese destroyer in the East China Sea around these Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, if I'm saying that right. I apologise if I'm not. What happened was the Chinese frigate, its firing radar locked onto the Japanese destroyer. just for a few moments, but of course the target can tell it's been locked on, right? There was never any intention to fire. It was to send a message, but it's quite a message to send. And of course, it's this kind of incident that can trigger a very rapid escalation into a full-blown war. And if there is a full-blown war, what will happen is any war that erupts between China and Japan automatically triggers America's treaty arrangements with Japan, and it's between China and the United States. And of course, Japan's not the only treaty partner with the United States, so are we, right? That's what's happening here. So that was the 30th of January. On the same day, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, wrote in the Council on Foreign Relations in New York's Foreign Policy magazine, where he poured fuel on the fire in an extraordinary way. First of all, he went to great lengths to describe how tense it was. He compared the Asia Pacific right now to the Balkans tinderbox pre-World War I. Of course, if you know your history, it was the state of the Balkans in World War I that made it very easy for those pushing for war, namely the British. Right? We have a British. We get taught a British version of history. Craig, Australians grow up thinking that it was all about the Kaiser, right? No, the World War I was between Queen Victoria's grandkids, and the main architect of it was King Edward, her son, King Edward VII. But the Balkans was very easy to turn into this trigger for war. So that's what Rudd's compared this to, but he put the whole blame on China. And the cause of the tension is tensions between China and Japan, China and Vietnam, China and the Philippines. i.e. China can't get along with anyone. That's what Rudd's saying. What's interesting about Rudd saying this, by the way, it's caused a bit of tension among the decision-making circles in Australia. Hugh White, the man we've been exposing in our New Citizen, whose public persona is for someone advocating peace with China, it's kind of smoked him out. He came out endorsing what Rudd said. He said, I'm glad he said it. So if he's endorsing Rudd, he's sort of exposed himself for what we've said. He's a warmonger. That's Rudd. Now, let's contrast it. There's another former Prime Minister in Australia, older generation, right? Malcolm Fraser, who is also a bit of a China expert, and we quoted him in our last paper. He wrote in the press today, this is from today's Sydney Morning Herald, where he's saying Australia needs to look at the other side. So I'll just read you his quote. Quote, "The New York Times is hardly a left-wing journal. Nicholas Kristof is a highly respected commentator. In the last part of last year, he gave his imprimatur to an article by a Taiwanese academic pointing out what was headed, the inconvenient truth behind the Dayu Senkaku Islands. Kristof wrote, I find the evidence for Chinese sovereignty quite compelling. The most interesting evidence is emerging from old Japanese government documents and suggests that Japan in effect stole the islands from China in 1895 as a booty of war. He then prints the article by the Taiwanese professor documenting these matters in detail." So Fraser highlights that fact, which no one in Australia ever talks about, and he ended his paper by saying, this is Fraser, "If we had a government with a sense of history and of the future, we would seek to use our influence for peace and moderation. We should make it plain to America that we will not be going to war on that issue. We should oppose provocative action by any party." He ended, "When is Australia going to have sufficient courage to act as an independent nation?" End quote. So what do you think of that call by Fraser, Craig?
Independence also has to do with the need for Glass-Steagall, for a national bank, and fighting for sovereignty, Robbie, first and foremost. Otherwise, all of this is all going to be an academic question.
All right, but we'll keep you posted on this program for the future. So we've run out of time, unfortunately. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.